going to move into our message this morning, and we are starting a new series in the book of Esther. And I'm going to start with a story. Who's done a first aid training course before? Nearly most of us, right? And if you've done a first aid course, you'll know that if you do them for work or for a role that you have, you often have to do them again and again and again to keep your skills refreshed and fresh in your mind. And I've done many of them in my roles over the years, and it's a day of refreshing your CPR skills and learning how to use a bandage and knowing the recovery position, knowing what to do with a splint, all those cool fun things to do if you have to respond in an emergency. And every time I do the course, it all feels familiar. Yeah, I've learned all this. I know what's going on because I've done it before, right? And it's all good to do it. And it's really important to keep that fresh in our minds and to go over it again and again. But often I do come away at the end of it going, okay, that was worth it. There was something that I had forgotten, something that had needed to be refreshed in my mind, or something that I haven't thought about until the course had come around again. Like, how many times do I need to address a snake bite? Less than I imagined, but it just doesn't come around unless you work at a place that has lots of snakes around, like some of the schools that some of our people work in here. But while I know cognitively that it's a good thing to do the course, it can feel monotonous to do it every couple of years, right? It can feel that way until you have to use the skills. Until that happens, the first time I had to engage my first aid training skills, I was on a youth camp and somebody collapsed right in front of me. And in the moment, my mind just went blank and was like, oh no, I'm responsible for this. What's going on here? But then I was like, oh, what's the recovery position again? And then my muscle memory kicked in, the training kicked in. The people around me and I were able to help this person, get them in the recovery position, get the help they needed. And thankfully, what I had been trained in came out in the moment. The training was important. It had shaped my instinct and my knowledge of what to do, which meant that when the moment arrived, I didn't have to panic and go, quick, find the manual. It was just something that I could go, here's what I have to do. Here's what I'm going to do. I didn't have to stop and check what had to be done. I could just act. Because our skills and our knowledge were formed long before by doing the first aid courses every couple of years, that monotonous, long-going training. It might feel mechanical and theoretical at the time, but in hindsight, it starts to make a lot more sense, right? Because all that preparation comes into play. And sometimes I get up and I try to tell stories from my life to be relatable and get you guys to get into the mindset I've been in as I've been preparing these sermons. And sometimes I try to tell funny stories or amazing stories where things have happened, or big funny things, or things where I've learned something deep and insightful. But let's be honest, that's not what my everyday is like. My everyday normal life feels, well, quite ordinary. It's routine, it's repetitive, it's the same daily life. And maybe in the routine, some of our life might seem like it goes unnoticed or is just forgettable. I can't tell you everything I did this week. A lot of it was the same old, same old. We wake up, we go to work, we look after our kids, or we study, or we check our emails, we pay our bills, we drive on the same roads, have the same conversations, and it all just starts to blur together. And if we're honest, there's seasons in our life where it just feels like nothing significant has happened at all. Like it's just been just an ordinary day, ordinary life, same old, same old. No big breakthroughs, no sudden opportunities, no sense that God is doing something new. It's just the same rhythms, the same responsibilities, the same people, the same struggles. And sometimes when we're in those seasons, we might quietly wonder, is this all there is to life? Is this going anywhere? Is this sermon going anywhere? Is God doing anything in my life right now? And it can feel like we're just waiting. But what if those ordinary moments aren't so empty? What if the daily life isn't wasted? What if, like the first aid training, something is being formed within us long before we know why? That's the part of life I want to think about and step into as we open up the book of Esther together. And over the next month, we're going to explore some of the themes and the ideas that come through in the book of Esther. And what strikes me about the book of Esther is how real it feels. Like it shows us how to live in the real and the ordinary moments, and then how to act when the big circumstances arise. Because while it would be nice when the big moments happen to have like a big clear sign from God telling us what to do in the high pressure moments, God is often shaping us quietly in the lead up long before those moments happen. And unlike other Bible stories, it talks about life just happening even when you don't have a prophet by your side telling you exactly what God is doing or saying, or you don't have an apostle writing you letters instructing you on how to live, or you don't have 2 stone tablets being handed down to you on the top of a mountain guiding your life. In fact, Esther is quite a unique book because this book never mentions God directly. Wow. Have you realized that? Esther doesn't mention God. And there's no miracles, there's no prophets, there's no big divine speeches from God to his people. There's just people navigating life the best they know how. And for Esther and Mordecai, they didn't have big signs from God telling them what they were supposed to do in the moments as they arose. They just happened to find themselves thrust into positions and situations where then they were able to influence events and to do the right thing and to try to save God's people in the midst of Persia. And yet underneath it all, as we're going to see, the unfolding story shows God still at work, even when he isn't at the forefront of the story. And so this book teaches us how to live in the ordinary and how to trust that God has been shaping us for when the big moments arrive, especially when we don't have a clear roadmap ahead, like when God isn't being overly explicit. It doesn't mean we wander aimless and directionless in life. It does mean, though, that we lean on what we already know of him, like his character and his word and his faithfulness and his expectations of us. And again, we're going to unpack that a lot. But when those moments come and we believe God has been training us and shaping us and forming us, it's those moments where that stuff starts to come out. If you're not familiar with the story of Esther, I encourage you to go and read the book yourself. But with what I want to share today, I thought it'd be helpful for us all to have a bit of a bird's eye view perspective of what's in the whole book. And so we start the story finding that they are in Persia. There's a large diaspora of Jews living post-exile in Persia. Not everyone had returned to Jerusalem at this time, so we're kind of set in the city of Susa. I'm going to say that's how you say it, Susa. I'll just be confident, you'll trust me. And King Xerxes is on the throne. And he throws a lavish 180-day feast, a 6-month feast, just to show off how rich he is. And he's getting everyone to come and say, look how great I am, look at my glory. And at the end of this 180-day feast, he decides, I'm going to get my Queen Vashti out. Everyone can check her out, see how beautiful she is. She can be shown off. But the queen refuses. And the king gets angry and he decides, you know what? She can't be queen anymore. He kicks her out. He gets rid of her, and that leaves a vacancy in the palace. And so a search begins across the land, across the empire, for young women to be gathered into the king's harem with the intent of finding a new queen. And among those taken is a young Jewish woman named Esther, who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai after her parents died. Esther didn't volunteer to go. She was just caught up in this system, taken and processed by the palace. And over time, she starts to gain favor with others, especially with the official in charge of the harem. And then eventually she gains favor with the king, and she is made the queen. Meanwhile, her cousin Mordecai has been continuing going about his ordinary life, working at the palace gate, and one day he overhears 2 officials plotting to assassinate the king. And he reports it through Esther, and the plot is stopped. And Mordecai is recognized, and his name is written into the royal records as the one responsible for saving the king's life. Yet there is nothing beyond that. There is no reward. There is no recognition outside of that. Life just continues on as normal for Mordecai. Meanwhile, a man named Haman was elevated in the empire. He has a huge ego, and he demands that people honor him and give him praise and respect and bow down to him because he now has a high position in the empire. Mordecai refuses to be this sort of person. He refuses to bow down to Haman, and Haman's ego and pride starts to turn into anger towards Mordecai. And so instead of just punishing Mordecai, he decides, I'm just going to annihilate his entire people. And so he plots to get rid of the Jews out of the empire. And so through manipulation and flattery, he secures the king's approval for his plan. Decrees are written up and sent out. A date is set, and the genocide of the Jews is legalized. The Jewish people mourn. And Mordecai sends word to Esther to say, hey, you need to do something about this. He tells her, you are in the palace. You have a place of influence. You have access to the king. You must go to him and do what is right. And so Esther begins to plan her approach to the king. But before that part of the story reaches its climax, something else happens. One night, the king can't sleep. And so he asks for the royal records to be brought to him. Maybe he was thinking, just read these boring records of the royal palace. Maybe that'll make me fall asleep. And so of all the records that could have been read to him, the account of Mordecai saving the king's life is read out. And the king sits up and he goes, wait, did we ever thank him for that? Did we ever recognize him? No, we didn't honor him. The king's like, we've got to fix that. So the next morning when Haman comes to see the king says to him, hey, what should be done to a man that the king really wants to honor? And Haman's like, oh, that's got to be me. So Haman outlines this amazing plan of the person being led through the city streets on the back of a horse, dressed in royal robes, and everyone being told, hey, this guy is worthy of the king's praise. And so Haman says, hey, this is what you should do. And then the king says, excellent, go do that for Mordecai. And Haman's like, what? This is my mortal enemy. Haman is enraged. He'd been planning Mordecai's death, and he now has to publicly celebrate him instead, leading Mordecai in this possession of honor, and he's frankly not happy. Back to Esther. She has decided that she's going to approach the king, but that's no easy thing. She has to gain an audience with the king, and approaching the king uninvited could mean certain death. If the king doesn't want to see you and you walk into his presence, kill him. It was that ruthless. And so Esther fasts and prepares, and one night she enters the king's presence, and the king says, yes, come forward. And she makes her approach and request to the king. She invites him to a series of banquets, and through these banquets, she exposes Haman's plot to destroy the Jewish people. The king realizes what he has authorized, and he's heartbroken, and he says, you know what? Haman has tricked me. I'm going to execute Haman. And so in a dramatic reversal, the Jewish people are then released from this genocide, and they are given the right to defend themselves. And what was supposed to be their destruction turns out to become their deliverance. Now, it's not a fairy tale romance story. It's a story of power and politics being played out. And yet through this entire story, God is never mentioned. It never says God told Esther to do this, God told Mordecai this. There's just a vacancy at the palace, a girl forced into a position, a conversation at the gate that's overheard, sleepless nights, delayed rewards, courageous risks. And yet by the end, it's clear that God was at work by using these ordinary events and shaping things quietly in the background so that the unfolding story would see his people preserved. God is often at work in the ordinary rhythms of our lives. Now, you might want to stop me and say, hey, Ben, there's nothing ordinary about being made a queen. And you're right. Not all of us are ever going to be made a queen. Nothing ordinary about that at all. But the process was ordinary for the people of Persia. And it unfolded slowly and gradually over the years that Esther was brought into this place and ended up rising through the ranks. There was no lightning bolt, no supernatural elevation of, I'm going to make Esther the queen, whoa, and then it happened. That wasn't there in the book. It's just a young woman living inside a system that she found herself in. And for Mordecai, his moment began at the palace, at the gate on an ordinary day, overhearing a conversation and doing the right thing when it would have been really easy to ignore it. He's not my king, he's a Persian king, I'm a Jew. Let it happen. No, he did the right thing. But for a long time, nothing came of that. I wonder if he thought, oh, that was a waste, or, oh, I could have been thanked, that would have been nice. But in the end, God was positioning both of them long before the crisis moment arrived. And to be honest, I think that's sometimes how God actually works. Whenever place we are finding ourselves in right now, our character is being shaped. Our patience is being formed. Our faithfulness is being developed, and our Christ-likeness is being deepened. We might not ever become royalty. We might not ever achieve notoriety and fame, but you are being formed where you are right now. We can't always look at our current circumstances and know exactly what God's doing or what he is shaping us for. And often we can only understand what God has been doing in us years later when we look back. You know, Esther chapter 2 only makes sense when you read Esther chapter 4 and 5. In the moment, it just feels ordinary, just going through the life. But in hindsight, we can actually start to sense God's providence. And so for you might be in a season right now where you are thinking, hey, nothing dramatic is happening. Or you're feeling overlooked, or you feel stuck. You just don't know what God's doing. Oh, is God even actually caring about me? Is he doing anything in my life? And what Esther's story suggests, and something that I've been pondering this week as we think about this deeper, Even though we can't see what God has planned ahead for us, he's often already at work in our ordinary circumstances. Not necessarily setting up for anything spectacular. I'm not saying that we're all going to go out and do spectacular things, but he's shaping us in the ordinary, making us more Christ-like. And I think it matters far more than we might imagine. I think about the daily interactions I have with my kids. You know, the daily routine of getting them up, getting them fed, getting them to school, feeding them again, taking them out and about the place, feeding them again, getting them to bed, feeding them again. It's a lot of feeding. But all those daily interactions, and even all the little interactions I have in between, the little conversations, the way I respond to them when they do something wrong, the way I praise them when they do something right. As each day passes and the monotony of the daily life happens, those ordinary moment interactions are shaping my kids drastically. And sometimes I see the good that comes out of it. They do amazing things. I'm like, wow, we've been raising them right. And sometimes I get embarrassed when I see my own shortcomings coming out of them. But the way both I and my kids are being shaped in these daily moments will matter in the long run. I think that's something true with God and us as well. In whatever ordinary season you're in right now, God might be simply shaping your faithfulness. He might simply be developing your faith to trust him more, building your spiritual muscle memory, as it were, or deepening your spiritual instinct, or forming your character, or preparing your heart for something. And one day that might come out and play. At the same time, you might be thinking, that's wishful thinking, Ben. That's all nice for people. Maybe you've abandoned or given up on the idea of God forming you or shaping you. Or maybe you look back over your life and there's regrets you have, or decisions you're not proud of, or moments you would redo if you could. I mean, sometimes I look back at my life and think, wow, I messed things up in that moment. I thought God was working on me, but it turns out I've still got far to go. The story of Esther reminds me that God can still work through imperfect people, and he can work through imperfect people in imperfect circumstances. It's not ideal that this girl is taken and made to be forced to be queen and forced to be part of a harem. Like, let's actually be honest. So you read that story, there's some horrific things going on. I glossed over it. And the story is not morally neat. There's some questionable actions in there. And yet God is still at work through it. And this isn't permission to be careless or casual with our obedience or our faith. Scripture still calls us to be faithful and obedient, but it's assurance that God's purposes are not so fragile that they're going to collapse under the weight of our missteps. God's much bigger than that. And if you feel you're in a situation of ordinary right now, maybe you could ask yourself the question, what if this ordinary season isn't being wasted? What if God is doing something in me right now? Whether you're 20 years old, whether you're 80 years old, God is still shaping us and forming us. What might God be forming in you quietly? What if the ordinary matters more than you think? Also, if you feel like you've been in an ordinary season for a long time, it's important to think, don't try and rush through or manufacture the moment of what you're being prepared for. Like, imagine I went to the first aid course and after the first half an hour, I'm like, got this, run outside and look for the first emergency I can find. I would be a terrible first responder. You would not want me giving you first aid if that was the case. But patience and training and shaping leads us to be better prepared for when the moment arrives. So be faithful and attentive. Be ready. Don't force it to happen. Don't try and rush to the end. Sometimes it takes time for us to be formed. Esther and Mordecai had to wait years for their moment to arrive. We're going to all walk through seasons when it feels like nothing at all is shifting. When we feel like there's no obvious calling or big dramatic breakthroughs. Times when it just feels like I am stuck in the ordinary. There is no visible movement happening. The book of Esther reminds us that when those seasons are happening, they are not empty. They're often preparatory. I don't even know if I said that word right, but they're preparation times. So don't panic when God feels quiet. If God feels quiet, it doesn't mean he's absent. You can still lean into him and read his word and hear what he's saying, but continue with the ordinary obedience and faithfulness to God. Stay steady. Trust that your unseen faithfulness matters, and believe that God is already a few steps ahead of us, a lot of steps ahead of us. And one day you might look back and realize, hey, this ordinary season that I felt stuck in, that was important preparation all along. Shaping and positioning and forming us long before we ever understood why. God is at work even when he still seems quiet. Whatever situation you're in, trust that God is at work and ask him, God, are you doing something in me right now? Maybe you could ask God, reveal to me what it is you're shaping. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's like, oh, cool, I see what you're doing, God. Or maybe sometimes it's like, oh, you're working on that. That's not so fun. But either way, God is still shaping us and working on us, helping us to become the people he wants us to be, so that when those moments come, when he needs us to act, we're not scrambling going through, what does the Bible say about this? We can just go, no, I trust God. Hey, I know what he's taught me. I know how to act in this moment. So why don't we pray? God, when we look at the ordinary days of our life, it can just be so difficult to see where you are at work, in the monotony or in the waiting or in the seasons of ordinary. But God, when we look at this book of Esther and we start to unpack it a lot, we can see that looking back on our own lives, God, you have a way of working in us in those ordinary moments, quietly shaping us and forming us. God, help us to take on the ordinary repetition of our faith practices in our daily lives. God, help us to trust you and what you are doing in us. God, help us to not feel stuck in the moment, but to trust that you are working and forming us for something that's yet to come. Thank you, Jesus, in your name. Amen.